Welcome to the Business of Race podcast, where we examine issues of race and racism, the impacts they have on business, and what organizations can do to effectively address those issues so that all employees have a healthier workplace. I'm your host, Regina Newkirk-Rucci, the Director of Equity for 90 Forward, a racial equity and justice nonprofit based in Jacksonville, Florida. And we are on the road today. We are in the beautiful city of Tampa. And joining me in the conference room is Lariana Forsythe, who is the CEO of CASA, which is Community
Action Stops Abuse.
Community Action Stops Abuse. I've known it as CASA all this time and didn't realize it was an acronym. Yeah. But I'm so excited to have you here because I think that this is an issue that has a lot of implications in race, but is also an issue that we really don't talk about.
Correct.
With employees, correct. Employers. And that is the issue of domestic violence. And I think that, when we talk about so many people have experienced domestic violence in some form or fashion.
Right.
And that tends to be even more significant among women of color in particular, but in communities of color.
Absolutely.
So let's start with, which seems like a simple thing, but what exactly is domestic violence?
Well, there's two definitions of domestic violence. The first is the legal definition, which includes physical violence against somebody. The second definition is a social definition, and it really is about all sorts of forms of power and control that one partner can exert over another partner. And those things can be verbal abuse, financial abuse, all sorts of other things that may or may not escalate to the point of physical violence at some point. But when there's power and control issues in a relationship, that really is giving one person power and control over another person. And so what we typically see in physical violence is a long period of those power and control tactics being used prior to it becoming physical.
Okay, so sort of like this is an escalation, right?
Correct.
I have financial control over you. I verbally abuse you. I start having some physical control over you and then going to physical abuse.
Correct.
All right. So I don't think that we have to explain why this is an important issue, right? Obviously, this is potentially jeopardizing the health and life of employees who are victims of domestic violence.
Absolutely.
Right? But I think a lot of employers might think that's something that's happening in their home. That's not our issue, but it definitely can impact you at work. So as we think about employer roles in this, I think the first one that I'd really like to discuss is just how can employers recognize? What are some signs that they should be looking for that one of their employees, and the truth of the matter is if you have a sizable company, you're likely to have someone in your company who is a victim of domestic violence.
Absolutely.
So what are some things that employers could be looking for that might indicate, wow, this is somebody who might be experiencing domestic violence?
So I think the first thing that we need to chat about, and I will get to your question, is the prevalency of domestic violence. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience domestic violence at some point in their life. And so for business owners who are thinking about their employee population and the idea that, this is their personal life, yes, it is their personal life, but because of the prevalency, it probably is happening, and there are great significant risks to the business if they aren't able to address that with their employee population. So for instance, CASA Pinellas, I operate at Pinellas County, in conjunction with USF St. Pete, we did an economic impact study of domestic violence in our county and determined that every single year there's $132 $2 million of economic impact in our county. So when we think about who's paying for those services, those are public services, right? Those are missed days from work. There's all sorts of things that are impacting employers on a day-to-day basis, on a large scale, not even just the employee directly.
Right. And even to the fact that if I am in an abusive relationship, my focus at work may not be there. I might be trying to disguise the fact that I have signs of being hit or what have you. I'm concerned about what state of my partner is going to be when I go home and what I can do. So it really does impact the employee at work, even if it's not happening at work. And sometimes it does even come to the workplace.
Sometimes it does come to the workplace. And yes, you have to think about it's a power and control issue, right? So just because a survivor or somebody who's in that situation is going to work, do you really think the perpetrator is leaving them alone? No, they're calling them. They're texting. Where are you? Who did you go to lunch with? What happened here? And the employee then may be very agitated, trying to keep the perpetrator calm and rationalizing with them. You can look at missed days of work. On average, somebody in a domestic violence relationship will lose an additional 7 days from work, and so you have increased absenteeism. So there's all sorts of things that we can take a look at. We can also take, and this is going to be controversial, we can take a look at mass violence. Most perpetrators of mass violence have some sort of domestic violence tie. Either they grew up in a domestic violence home, or they have been convicted of domestic violence. And a lot of those mass violence situations are happening at workplaces. They're following their victim to work and taking, some serious steps there. So it can be a very dangerous situation for an employer not to be hyper aware of what's going on when an employee is in a domestic violence situation.
And I think those are so many really important points to think about that I don't think would be on the average employer's radar.
Correct.
So that is tremendous information. Okay, this is important. I need to pay attention. I need to know if that's happening amongst my employees. I generally not just going to say, hey, are you in an abusive relationship?
Correct.
So what are some things that I should be looking for if I now know that this is a key factor, something that we should be paying attention to? What are some things that are, that's an identifier. That's something that registers as we need to follow up on
right. That. So I think it's important, a couple things. It's not advisable for somebody to approach somebody that they think is in a domestic violence situation and say, hey, what's going on at home. But it is important to be there as a resource and to be providing information. So just being aware, trying to look for those signs, again, increased absenteeism, being very frantic, be on their phone a lot and being distressed, showing signs of PTSD, those kinds of things, and then making yourself or somebody in your company available to have conversations. Are you okay? I'm here to help you. And allowing that person who's in that relationship the space and the comfort to bring that to the table if and when they are comfortable to do so. We need to remember that our society, and we talked about it at first, this is not something that is comfortable. This is not something that we talk about. You'll see in the media even references to murder suicides all the time. They don't call it domestic violence. They don't call it interpersonal violence. People really don't understand how prevalent it really is because we don't put a name on it. We don't talk about it. And so with CASA, our tagline is actually stand up to silence. But we want to just be there for employees so that they know that they have a resource if and when they're ready to talk about it. The most dangerous time for a survivor of domestic violence, the most lethal time, is if and when they choose to lose their partner because their partner is losing control. And that's when things oftentimes turn very deadly. And so we need to be careful and respect that survivor's privacy and space, but be a resource for them.
So you think about resources, because I think resources are important, right? I think in this kind of situation, there's a lot that the person who is the survivor, decisions they have to make. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But for the employer, what kinds of resources are some ideas of things that they could do to have available that if an employee says, I need help, they could go and they could access that pretty easily, and recognizing that unfortunately in the society there's a tremendous amount of shame and regret that survivors might feel being in this situation. And so acknowledging that, hey, I'm in a domestic violence relationship, or I have an abusive partner and I need help, is an extremely difficult thing to say for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Right? So what are some things and resources or things that employers could put in place to really make that a little bit easier?
So the first thing to really consider is generally, again, because it's a difficult subject, a lot of times in our conversations about domestic violence, we unintentionally victim blame. Things like, well, I don't know how you could allow this to continue. I would never let myself be in this kind of a situation. Well, you don't know, and we can unintentionally say things that will be hurtful or cause a victim to, again, feel that they're doing something wrong. Abuse is never a victim's fault. It is the perpetrator's fault. And so as an employer, it's important to be a safe person, to be careful with language, making sure that we're not victim blaming, but providing resources to a professional domestic violence agency. CASA represents Pinellas County, but there's 41 centers throughout the state of Florida. Every county has a center that is experts in this space that provide all sorts of resources and tools for survivors of domestic violence. So making that information available, putting it in the bathrooms, sending out emails so the employees have that information, but then also making sure that employees are aware of the state statute. We have in Florida a state statute that organizations with 50 or more employees are required to give somebody who is in a domestic violence situation days off of work to be able to deal with their situation. So making sure that everybody is really aware of those different opportunities.
And it also sounds like, because I didn't know that, and that seems like a really important statute to make sure that people are aware of.
Yes.
But then also making sure that, HR really, there's a very clear process, and I know exactly what it is that I need to do, and there's not a lot of pushback and resistance to getting those days off that I need to deal with that situation.
Yes.
All right. And so, I think that we've talked about employers, but oftentimes this is an employee issue, right? And so I think having those resources from the employer is important. But if I'm an employee and my coworker comes and has sunglasses on, and I see a little bit of a bruise here, and I've heard some conversations that she's had with her partner, and I have a suspicion that this might be happening. What are some things that I could do to help support that employee so that I can provide whatever is needed, as well as help, if need be, get her into or him into a better situation?
So oftentimes coworkers, friends are going to be aware that there's something going on before there's physical violence. So they, like you had said, will have heard conversations and things that make them suspect. And I think it's really important to just be a resource. Is everything okay at home? If you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here for you. Making sure the information, again, about the Domestic Violence Center is front and center. But people who are in domestic violence situations, it's not just physical violence. We talked about the other forms of power and control. So somebody who's in a relationship, there's oftentimes this web of difficulties for that person. So again, there's the financial control or isolation from family and friends. So there's all of these layers for somebody to try and figure out if they're wanting to leave that relationship. How do I escape all of these different layers and complexities? And so as a coworker and someone who's trying to help to understand that dynamic, it's not as easy as people would think, and to be a resource for that person if and when they're ready, because they really understand the danger and the lethality that they're in, and they need to make the choices that are appropriate for them given their particular situation, with, of course, appropriate resources like the Domestic Violence Center.
Right. And I think also really, again, that lack of judgment in the conversation. I have been startled a few times when I have had been in conversations with people. And again, it's so easy. Like, why don't you just leave him?
Right.
It's like, there are kids involved. There's money involved. Where are you going?
Housing. It's so complex.
And where are you going to stay? I'm like, this is not a just what kind of cereal are you having for breakfast in the morning?
And remember, victims are terrified, right? They're terrified. If he thinks I'm going to leave, what is he going to do to me? And that could be more dangerous than staying. And so it's untangling all of those complexities. And I will tell you, every single case is very different. Because you're dealing with different people and different dynamics, and it's very complicated to figure out. Not that it can't be done, but you need the appropriate resources and people on your team to help untangle that web and see a way through the forest.
Right. And so think, the more that you can support your colleague without judgment and pointing them to experts who can assist with that.
Absolutely. And we've had cases where, coworkers or bosses have noticed the absenteeism, have noticed the marks, have noticed the erratic behavior from the significant other, the perpetrator. They've noticed all these things and they've documented it. And so ultimately, when it's gone to court, they've been able to support that survivor with documentation of things that they've observed.
Right. So that's another really important one. And I was actually going to ask you about that. Documenting, even if the person isn't ready yet.
Correct.
Anytime you notice something, documenting that. Because later, should they decide, I'm really ready to leave, or I'm going to need to involve the courts to do it, there's proof of some support of what they're saying.
Absolutely. And there's several different layers of legal work. I mean, the first step is often an injunction for protection. And so they need to be able to prove the violence. And so, yes, you could absolutely, if you've noticed some marks on her, that could be the proof that she needs to get that injunction to be able to safely get away. If there's criminal proceedings down the line, it could be helpful there as well.
All right. Oh, wow. That's just so much information. So it's really good information. So now I want to talk about two people who I think are two parties in this that are extremely important.
Yes.
So now let's talk about people who are actually in situations of domestic violence. What are some things that they may be able to do or get to help protect themselves, and how might they be able to use the resource of their employer to do those things?
So that's two big questions.
Sorry, I don't ask the small questions.
So I think domestic violence is so complicated because oftentimes people don't even realize that they're in a domestic violence situation. Again, nobody gets into a relationship and somebody hits them and they say, oh, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. It starts by other things. And so, isolation is typically how it starts, right? Baby, I love you so much. I want to spend all my time with you. You shouldn't be going to your family functions. They don't love you like I do. I'm your man, you spend your time with me. So that feels really great, right? You've got somebody who really loves you. It feels really great. So now as it moves on, right? And now you're never going to your families or not allowed to see your friends, or they're tracking what you're doing. These things build over time. And oftentimes, we use the analogy, a frog, if you put him into boiling water, he's going to jump right out, right? But you bring him up to temp and slowly boil him. There's gaslighting that's involved. There's all sorts of things that change, how someone is perceiving their situation. So that's a long tangent to explain that it's really important for us to be providing information about what domestic violence is. Again, because when we go back to the original social versus legal definition, right? All of that social stuff is happening that leads to the physical domestic violence. And people need to understand that those things are oftentimes a pathway. And so it's important for employers, and I am getting to your questions, to be sharing that information, or for all of us in our communities, to be sharing that information widely so that people understand if, your ex is stalking you, or if your partner is, putting their fists through walls, they're not touching you, right? That is domestic violence, and it will oftentimes escalate to physical violence. So it's understanding all of those things and what the pathway is, so that hopefully somebody can really get some help before it turns violent. There's other things. I'll take the opportunity to talk about strangulation. Strangulation shows physical marks on less than 50% of victims. And so if somebody has been strangled, they are 800 times more likely to ultimately be killed by the person that strangled them, usually by a gun, and oftentimes in mass violence. So there's a high correlation to strangulation and ultimate death for survivors of domestic violence. So information like that, if an employer can put that out and somebody who's ever been strangled sees that, they would really understand what a serious situation they're in, and it likely could turn lethal.
And there's so many places you can do that, right? We talked about employee break rooms. You can have even during Domestic Violence Month or Week, just some recognition.
Absolutely.
Talks about it. You can have it maybe even as a page on the benefits site.
Absolutely.
There are places that it doesn't have to be intrusive. Employees can choose to go and don't even have to be seen getting the information. Correct. But really important to put those kinds of statistics out there.
And always pushing it out, right? Because you don't know when somebody is going to need it. I can't tell you how many times I've gone in and talked to people in an organization. They've heard the information, and a year or two down the line, they're able to share that with somebody because somebody else has disclosed to them that they're in a situation. You don't know when you're going to need it, so putting it out there frequently is very, very important.
Right. And I think, and sometimes we have in our mind who a victim might be. And I think it's really important. Again, you said 1 in 3 women,
correct,
right, is going to experience this. And men are also victims of domestic violence. So knowing that whatever stereotype you have in your mind does not by any means include all victims. And so recognizing that could be anyone.
Absolutely.
And you having the information at the ready is important for somebody else who might need it, as well as you might be the person who needs it at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is very, very helpful. And I also want to talk about a group that I think doesn't get talked about a lot. And that is the perpetrators of violence. I have been in a work situation where I really strongly suspected that one of my coworkers was abusing his partner. And there oftentimes aren't resources for perpetrators. What are some things that employers could be doing as well to help people who are perpetrating violence? And what are some of the resources that they can direct those people to so that it doesn't escalate and actually de-escalates and stops occurring?
Well, education is so important. I mean, there's a lot of people, and the problem with domestic violence is it's generational oftentimes, right? You grow up in a household where you're seeing the power and control issues, you're seeing the violence. Oftentimes, people grow up to be perpetrators and victims because that's what they're familiar with. They haven't been taught relationship skills and boundaries and things of that nature. So education is really important. There are a lot of perpetrators that are never going to change. There's a lot of perpetrators who can, if they are provided the information and the tools and they understand the impact of their actions. Oftentimes they don't really understand those issues. And so there is a program, it's offered throughout the country, but in Florida it is offered in every single county. It's called Batterers Intervention. And so it is a course where perpetrators, it's often ordered by the court, but but it is available to people to go to this course and to really learn, A, what are power and control issues, and B, how do you really change your behavior so that it is not abusive. And so that course is available.
And so that's, again, something else that employers can make public. And I think you also have to sort of talk about that, right?
Right.
The fact that this is not okay, because I have been in a lot of conversations where I've heard, oh, that's just how so-and-so is, or he had a bad day, or, she gets that way sometimes if she's been drinking, those kinds of things, really educating that that's not okay.
Right.
Ever.
Right.
And if you are falling victim to that, then you need to take these steps. And that information is available. And I think even just a lot of benefits programs have an EAP program, something that you can call and get those kinds of help, have those kinds of conversations with a professional who can help you deal more effectively, because generally that tends to be an issue of anger, of control, right? And dealing with both of those.
Yes and no. I mean, oftentimes, and this is one of the issues that we have, is that a lot of people in our system are ill-informed about what the solution is for a perpetrator. It really isn't about anger, and oftentimes they will be sent to anger management. It's not an anger issue. It is a power and control issue. And so oftentimes people will be sent to anger management, and it doesn't solve the domestic violence tendencies. So we have to be careful with that. And I will tell you, most judges will order anger management. It is not an appropriate resource for a debtor.
Well, and again, I think this is why it's so important that we're having this conversation, because I would think, oh, you don't know how to control your anger. You let your anger get out of control and it escalates to this point. But this is really an issue of control and power. And probably something as far as finding your own self-worth and value in that power and control that you're exerting, right? That you can then blame on anger. So that's, I think, extremely important to recognize. And so putting that information even out. Right?
Absolutely.
Right. So this is really fantastic. And again, this is the Business of Race podcast. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that domestic violence occurs at a higher rate with women of color and in communities of color, and often can be more deadly for women of color. So it's really important that we acknowledge this for all victims.
Absolutely.
But I want to just sort of highlight why we're talking about it today.
Absolutely. And one of the statistics that you and I discussed briefly before is that more than half of Black women who are murdered every single year in this country are murdered by their intimate partner. Right. And that's a scary statistic.
That is a frightening statistic. And certainly if we have the ability to prevent that from happening, steps that we can take and putting that information out, we want to do that. Oh, so Lariana, it's just been so wonderful having you in the conference room today. I really appreciate it. We always would want to end with, that last one big takeaway. So we've had such a robust conversation, and unfortunately one that we don't have often enough. If I'm an employer listening to this, okay, what's the one big takeaway you would have for employers from what we've talked about today?
This is a complicated issue. It doesn't warrant judgment from employers. It warrants information so that survivors and, as you mentioned, perpetrators have access to information. They understand what it is. This is not something we talk about. Nobody knows how to fix the situation. So